We now turn the discussion toward building economic power. Today, racial disparities still exist across the labor market, and there is still disproportionate access to capital and growth opportunities for Black business owners. Systemic inequities still limit access to home ownership as well. I'm pleased now to welcome economist Darrick Hamilton to discuss economic equity and closing the racial wealth gap. Hamilton is the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and the founding director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School in New York City. Thank you for being with us today, Darrick.
Thank you. An honor to be on this stage.
Wonderful. Well, when we talk about economic disparities, particularly racial economic disparities, what does that mean? What are we talking about?
I mean, we need only look at the wealth gap to see how vivid disparities are. And in earnest, if we were to summarize the racial disparities in economic terms, the racial wealth gap, where the typical Black household has often less than a dime than a typical white household, and that these disparities rise with education, so that it's not uncommon that Black households where the head graduated from college will have less wealth than those that are white, whose head dropped out of high school. I mean, that's a problem, and that's an example of this disparity, largely because not only wealth as an outcome, but what wealth can do for one's life. So the agency that's afforded to people because they have capital, because they have economic might, illustrates that we have people that are divided largely on something that is, I don't want to use the word cursory as it relates to an aesthetic, as it relates to a history and a culture, but as it relates to a transaction, something as cursory as one's phenotype of race or race.
Do we know what is causing some of these disparities that we see when it comes to being able to build wealth? Is it lack of education, lack of job opportunity? What causes it?
The main ingredient for wealth building is capital itself. The various things that you mentioned are useful. If you have a job that puts you in a pension, that provides automatic savings for you as you age towards retirement, that's useful. But at its core, it is wealth that begets more wealth. So we have a history. We emphasize property rights in this current economic paradigm, as opposed to economic rights for people. Now, the problem with property rights and that emphasis is that it's often examined in an ahistoric manner. So if we were to look historically over the course of this nation, we can see that Black people have been denied access to capital, that the government interventions, as well as private interventions that have afforded one set of people access to capital was not afforded to Black people. And we can go through and name the litany of it. But here's another point. Even when Black people have been able to overcome barriers and accrue resources, historically it has been vulnerable, not politically protected in the ways that the wealth of white people has. Examples are Tulsa, Oklahoma, where we know that race massacre that took place in 1919 was an example where whatever capital that Black people had accrued was lost. I mean, we can go through other examples as well. We can look at the great land loss of Black farmers throughout American history, which is indicative of a U.S. Department of Agriculture, as well as other malfeasance that have defrauded them out of their property.
Listening to these, some of these reasons for why we still have this racial wealth gap. Senator Cory Booker and Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley recently reintroduced baby bond legislation. Can you talk a little bit about what baby bond legislation is and how it could help address some of these inequities we've just been discussing?
Thank you. I mean, and that baby bonds gets at the root of the problem. Right, we led with capital is the root of the problem if one is to generate wealth. Well, baby bonds provides a trust account at birth for everyone. So it seeds capital as a birthright. So that is in the domain of economic rights directed at people. So this is an example of a policy where based on the family economic position in which one is born, an account is established at birth. and that account accrues greater resource over time and is protected in a similar way that Social Security is protected, so that when that child ages into adulthood, they have some nest egg so that they can generate the benefits that's afforded to other people who are born into resource, namely some capital to purchase a home as a down payment, some capital to invest in a debt-free college education, some capital to start a business. I mean, what we know is that however much effort and however much ingenuity an individual might have, it's limited without capital. So that's the aim of this policy. And, I'll say one last thing, and that is, it's not so novel. It's not so novel in the sense that we don't have an American history where we've seen similar policies of government foundations of capital that have afforded people the capabilities of building wealth. So at issue was those policies that came out of a New Deal, those policies that came out of a World War II with a GI Bill. They were not administered, distributed, or designed in a way that was race inclusive. So we have examples of success in American history. I think right now, I applaud Senator Booker and Representative Presley for putting forth a policy grounded in that history that can provide a way forward of government providing an economic rights foundation for its people, not simply for consumption purposes, but to enhance capabilities, and to do it in a way that's explicitly anti-racist or racially inclusive.
I can't help but think of when we're talking about baby bonds and the way that it would help to close that racial wealth gap. It would help to establish sort of that fund that is needed, as you mentioned, whether that's for college, for home, buying your first home. It also leads me down, we're going to get into a little tricky right now, reparations, which have obviously been a huge conversations that have been going for so long. How do baby bonds and reparations, when we talk about economic closing that racial economic disparity, how could reparations and baby bonds together, separate? Is there a way to have them linked together?
Yeah, I mean, I love that question. And I'll also state that there is no silver bullet policy for providing economic prosperity in a well-functioning economy, that there's a slew of policies that need to be enacted. But thinking about reparations and baby bonds, they're not substitutes, rather they're complements. What reparations does that baby bonds doesn't do is it includes a truth and reconciliation. And in earnest, it would be a more direct, parsimonious way to redress the racial wealth gap. But that truth and reconciliation accompanied by material redress would provide new narratives for public policies, not one grounded in deficits amongst the lower earning populations or the populations on the bottom. We get rid of some of those myths around deadbeat dads, welfare queens, and predators, and rather understand inequality from what it is sourced by, which is resource deprivation. So that truth and reconciliation about Black people will not only benefit Black people, but white people and public policy in general. But the redress would be specific to Black people and would be a direct way to redress the racial wealth gap. But let me say this, reparations wouldn't be enough either, because it's a retrospective policy. It needs to be complemented by something like baby bonds, which in a prospective way, in a forward-looking way, ensures that however capital consolidates in the future, and it will consolidate in the future, both economic power, political power, and capital in general, there is an automatic stabilizer, so to speak. There is a permanent policy that ensures that capital is distributed in a more just way. And reparations, unfortunately, won't do that. It will be a great step forward and something that's vitally useful, but it needs to be complemented with something like baby bonds. And vice versa, baby bonds, these are all good policies, and we should not stand in the way of them going forward. But if we're ever to reckon with our racial history, if our racial disparity, and then, the original sin of America in general, it is necessary that reparations is ultimately enacted.
One of the topics of conversation that folks have discussed, especially much more recently for helping close the racial wealth gap, is student loan debt relief. And we'll actually be hearing oral arguments for student loan debt relief next week. Talk a little bit about when we say that could help close the racial wealth gap. How does helping forgive student loans affect Black Americans enough that it can help bridge that gap just a little bit?
Yeah, and I want to be careful here. We've become somewhat creatures of our success in moving to the lexicon the importance of closing the racial wealth gap. In practice, getting rid of student loan debt will have an impact on the racial wealth gap, but it'll be somewhat limited, largely because the main component of the racial wealth gap, in an accounting sense, is the asset difference, the difference in asset ownership between Blacks and whites. But nonetheless, we absolutely need to really have a jubilee with regards to student loan debt. And then we need to enact a policy that provides a debt-free college education, public education for everyone, so we don't end up in this problem again. In other words, the problem of debt, the albatross of basically making a person an indentured borrower for something as critical in the 21st century as a college degree, is immoral and actually counterproductive for a fair, efficient economy that provides pathways for everyone to be striving to be their best selves. So, just to summarize real quick, getting rid of the albatross of debt on our young people is reason enough. And if we consider the racial dimensions, we have Black people where we tell them your pathway to mobility is to get a college degree. All you got to do is get a college degree. And by the way, let me just reiterate that a college degree is important in and of its own self, but it won't be enough. But nonetheless, we encourage them to get a college degree, which is right. It costs them more to get that college degree because of the existing racial wealth gap. And then also because of discriminatory elements in our society, the rate of return on that college degree for Black people is less than that of their white counterparts. So something we should not do is impose that albatross of debt on Black people in particular, but young people in general.
I hear us talking about some of these policies ideas, right? This idea of forgiving student loan debt, baby bond legislature. I can't help but ask, are we at least on the right track toward economic equity?
I think so, but there's a cautionary tale. As you've been speaking with some of your other guests, when we're talking about banning books, the cautionary tale is that we're on the precipice of something dramatically worse than what we currently have if we go one pathway. But there's a bright spot, there's a silver lining, even from this pandemic. I mean, during this pandemic, the IRS remarkably sent direct income to people with somewhat relative ease compared to what we could have imagined that they did, without which, imagine our society if we didn't send out those checks to individuals. We would have went into a deep depression. So that might have been unheard of as a response, say 10 years ago. So I'm seeing that. I mean, we had the refundable child tax credit. We had that enacted. Unfortunately, it was not made permanent. But consider that in the context of welfare reform, and you see me put the air quotes up in, when 20 years ago, we could not fathom sending money directly to poor people. Rather, we just wanted to discipline them. So there are inklings and some silver linings of some policy apparatus that are a break or different from this past 40 to 50 years of perhaps neoliberalism, where we've had this dogma, this faith that all we have to do is invest in corporations and it'll trickle down to all of us. Provide tax breaks, which, by the way, is a government expenditure, that if that's all we did, that would lead to what's best for society, and then we would all be good. Well, we are learning that there's other ways to invest in our society. There's a human rights economies approach. There's an industrial policy approach that government invests directly in our most treasured resource, and that is our people. Invest in people and the places they live and watch them thrive and watch them create a dynamism where we all benefit. We're starting to see that take place. I mean, we need that momentum, and we need not let the despair of politics sway us away from demanding from our government that we continue down that path. And then one other element, that we do it in a way that's anti-racist, that's anti-sexist, that we ensure when we design these policies, that when we implement and manage these policies, that we're not doing it in a way that's exclusionary to populations that are absolutely deserving and that have been excluded in the past.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Mr. Darrick Hamilton, for being here with us today. We enjoyed your insight.
Thank you.